This is the 8th and final sermon in our series on the life of Joseph. And in case you're wondering, we're not going to be able to finish the story today. And I told you that this is the last sermon, so we're not going to be able to finish it all. So this is it today. In fact, we couldn't finish the story if we spent another month on it. There's just way too much information, and we don't have enough time to do that. We also realize that people get tired of a certain topic, so we move on. This is the 8th sermon, so we're going to call it quits today. Anyways, because we're calling it quits, I'm going to skip a chapter rather than pick up where we left off last time, because I want to cover chapter 47. And again, this is going to be the last chapter that we do cover. So turn in your Bible, if you would, to the book of Genesis, chapter 47, verses 13 and 14. Hold on a second, because we're not going to read it right away. I want to give you a little bit of information. You need to know certain things. At this point in the story, the focus shifts back to the famine and how Joseph saved the nation of Egypt from starvation. Now, the reason this section is important is because it explains in a very simplistic manner what Joseph did during a time of national crisis. And the policies that he instituted and the steps that he took provide an example of how government should respond in times of economic hardship. Now, having said that, let me point out one important detail. This section is very short. It goes from verse 13 to verse number 26. And there aren't many details given, just the basics of what Joseph did in this dire situation. And does anyone know why? Well, the reason it's so short is because it's only meant to give us basic fundamental principles to base our government policies on. Now, these principles still apply today. And if a nation violates these principles, there's dire results or consequences as a result of that. And people, that includes America. If you want to know why America's in trouble today, it's because we have violated these biblical principles. So I'm going to lay them out for you. I'm not going to try and become political. I know that we have the midterm elections coming up, so I'm not going to use this to try to sway your votes. But you do need to understand that the Bible has given us everything that pertains unto life and godliness. And if your faith does not affect the way that you vote, then you're really not a Christian. Now, I'm not saying you're not a believer and you're not going to heaven. I'm not saying that at all. But the word Christian means Christ-like. It means that you follow Christ's example. The Bible has given us everything that we need that pertains to life and godliness. In other words, our spiritual life and our physical life. Now, if it's given us everything that pertains to that, it means that it's laid out principles that should affect us in every area of our life, right? And that's why we're covering this section, if you don't mind. So, having said that, let's read verses 13 and 14. Meanwhile, the famine became so severe that all the food was used up, and people were starving throughout the lands of Egypt and Canaan. By selling grain to the people, Joseph eventually collected all the money in Egypt and Canaan, and he put the money in Pharaoh's treasury. Now, I want you to notice that when the people ran out of food, the government did not give them food. It sold them food. Now, let me give you a little background information before I explain why this is so important. If you remember, during the 7 years of prosperity, the 7 years before the famine, Joseph collected 20% of all the crops that were harvested in preparation for this famine. In essence, he imposed a 20% tax on the people. So the government took 20% and the people kept 80%. Look back at Genesis chapter 41, verses 34 through 36. It says, then Pharaoh should appoint supervisors over the land and let them collect 1/5. How much is that? 20% for those of you who are not good with math. Then collected 1/5 of all the crops during the 7 good years. Have them gather all the food produced in the good years that are just ahead and bring it to Pharaoh's storehouses. Store it away and guard it so there will be food in the cities. That way there will be enough to eat when the 7 years of famine comes to the land of Egypt. Otherwise, this famine will destroy the land. Now, here's what's interesting. The people were allowed to keep 80% of what they harvested, but they ran out of food shortly after the famine started. If you remember, the people started buying grain in Egypt or from Egypt during the first year of the famine. We know that because Joseph's brothers came to buy grain almost a year before Joseph revealed himself to them. Do you remember that? And we know he revealed himself to them during the 2nd year of the famine. Look at Genesis chapter 45, verses 5 through 6. This is this passage of Scripture where Joseph reveals his true identity. He reveals to his brother who he really is. But remember, this is their second trip back to Egypt. They came a year before this. Notice what it says. But don't be upset and don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. Because once they found out who Joseph was, they were terrified. They were panic-stricken. They thought that he was going to get even with them, maybe put them to death or maybe enslave them. And he says, don't worry about it. Listen to me, listen to me. God did this for a reason. He did this so I could preserve your lives. And then he goes further. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years. So we know that when Joseph revealed himself to his brothers, they were 2 years into the famine. Now, just to make sure that we understand this, let's keep reading. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years. So they're only into 2 years of this famine. And there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. So that tells us that the people started running out of grain shortly after the famine started. In other words, in the beginning of the first year. Now, I want you to think about this. The government taxed the people 20% during the 7 years of prosperity, and the people kept 80%. And yet they ran out of grain shortly after the famine started, which tells us that they were living from year to year, or as we would say, from paycheck to paycheck. In other words, they were consuming everything they took in, and they weren't saving anything for the future. So when their grain ran out, there was still 6.5 years of the famine to go. So the government was going to have to feed all of the people for 6.5 years on the 20% they collected. But the people were used to living on 80%. So how was the government supposed to make the 20% they collected last for 6.5 years? How were they going to feed all of those people? And at the same time, make the grain last 6.5 years. And if you want to get technical, 7.5 years. Now, why do I say 7.5? Because they wouldn't be able to reap a harvest until a year after the last year of the famine. Does that make sense? So how in the world did Joseph make the 20% that he collected during the 7 good years, the 7 years of prosperity, last for 7.5 years with a nation that was used to consuming 4 times that much, 80%? Well, the first thing that he did was he made them pay for the grain that they received. He didn't give it to them. He didn't come in and say, oh, here, let's open up the doors. No, he made them take from their savings in order to pay for it. Because Joseph knew that when the people saw their savings dwindling, they wouldn't waste the grain. Listen to me. It's human nature to waste when times are good. You know, we go to the restaurant and we want the big portion, right? And we don't eat it all. But that's okay. Times are good. We never think about that. We buy a pair of shoes. We don't like them. We give them away. No big deal. Times are good. It's human nature to do that. But when times are bad and we have to start taking out of our savings to buy necessities, then we become frugal. You know, I'll say this about my father-in-law. My father-in-law never threw anything away. Now, I'm not talking about trash. He wasn't a hoarder. But if you ever went to his house, he kept everything. And he kept building these barns, and he would put his possessions in these barns. And I'd look at some of this stuff, and I would think, man, that's crap. But you don't want to know why Cooey did that? Cooey grew up in the Depression. I can remember one time I was in a barn with him, and there was an old leather shoe there, and I said, Cooey, why in the world do you keep that? I was wondering if it had sentimental value. He picked that thing up, and he said, Alan, times could get tough. That leather, that sole, that could be a hinge on a shed. And I looked at that, and I thought, oh my gosh, I would throw that away. But you don't want to know why he didn't? He lived through the Depression. You see, when times are good, we waste things. But when times are bad, and we start having to take out of our savings to buy necessities, we become frugal. You see, Joseph understood human nature. He knew that if he gave the people food, they would continue to waste it. And if he made them pay for it, They would be frugal with it. So he started by making the people buy the grain out of their savings. I like to say it like this: there is no free lunch. Make sure that your kids understand that. There is no such thing as a free lunch, or at least there shouldn't be. Joseph had no free lunch. Again, because Joseph understood human nature. He understood that if he wasn't careful, the famine would create an entitlement mentality within the people, especially if the government gave the food away. Joseph knew that if the government did that, then the people would come to expect the government to take care of them during difficult situations. So he made the people pay for what they received, and when they couldn't pay for it, what did he do? He made them barter for what they received, which brings us to verses 15 through 17. Notice what it says. When the people of Egypt and Canaan ran out of money, what are they going to do? They've run out of money. Well, when the people of Egypt and Canaan ran out of money, all of the Egyptians came to Joseph. Our money is gone, they cried, but please give us. See that word, give. But please give us food, or we will die before your very eyes. Our blood will be upon your hands. Joseph replied, since your money is gone, what a miserly man. Since your money is gone, bring me your livestock. I will give you food in exchange for your livestock. So they brought their livestock to Joseph in exchange for food. In exchange for their horses, flocks of sheep and goats, herds of cattle and donkeys, Joseph provided them with food. Now notice this. For the rest of the famine? No. For another year. Now I want you to notice. When their money was gone, the people wanted the government to give them food. And Joseph said no. Look at verse 15 again. When the people of Egypt came and ran out of money, all of the Egyptians came to Joseph. Our money is gone, they cried, but please give us food, or we will die before your very eyes. But again, Joseph refused to give it away. Instead of giving them food, he made them barter for it. Now people, this is the equivalent of having to sell your valuables. This is the equivalent of having to sell your assets. Whatever you have, you're going to have to sell it. That's what Joseph is telling them. I don't care if you don't have anything left. If you want grain, you're going to have to sell it. You got a donkey? Bring the donkey. You got chickens? Bring the chickens. Whatever you have, you're going to have to bring it in. Again, Joseph knew that if he gave it away, the people wouldn't be frugal with it. Instead, they would waste it. And it wouldn't be long before all of the grain was gone. Remember, the 20% they collected during the 7 years of prosperity had to feed the people during the 7 years of famine. And to do that, they couldn't waste any of it. Now, do you want to know why America has a $21 trillion national debt and a $984 billion deficit? And hopefully you know the difference between a deficit and national debt. But you want to know why our national debt is so high? You want to know why we have a deficit? It's because we waste money. And do you want to know why we waste money? The reason we waste money is because our government gives things to people. Thank you. And if you can't clap for that, then you need to start praying. Something's wrong in your life. People, we don't make people pay for it. We don't make them earn it. We give it away, and that's not what the Bible teaches. Now, it didn't take long before they had traded all of their assets, all of their valuables for grain. So now they had nothing left to trade for food, which brings us to verses 18 and 19. Notice what it says. But that year ended, and the next year came again and said, we cannot hide the truth from you, my Lord. Our money is gone, and all of our livestock and cattle are yours. We have nothing left to give but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Just give us grain so we may live and not die, and so the land does not become empty and desolate. Now I want you to notice that verse 18 begins with, but that year ended. Does anyone know what year this is referring to? Anyone? It's referring to the third year. You see, They started buying grain sometime during the first year of the famine. That's when Joseph's brothers came, during the first year of the famine. But by the end of the second year, that year that he revealed himself to them, their money had run out. So by the third year, they were trading anything they could. They were taking their cows, they were taking their livestock, any valuable assets they had, they were selling it for food. But by the end of the third year, their money and all of their assets and all of their valuables, they were gone. So notice what they said. Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Now I want you to notice what Joseph's policies had done for the people. Look at verses 18 and 19 again. But that year ended, the third year, fourth year's beginning. And the next year they came again and said, we cannot hide the truth from you, my Lord. Our money is gone, and all our livestock and cattle are yours. We have nothing left to give but our bodies and our land. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Just give us grain so we may live and not die, and so the land does not become empty and desolate. Do you see that? By the fourth year of the famine, the people no longer had an entitlement mentality. They no longer expected the government to give them food. They expected to either pay for it or earn it. People, that's impressive. That's the power of having the right policies. If you have the wrong policies, people expect you to give it to them. If you have the right policies, they don't expect you to give it to them. They have to pay for it or they have to earn it. But people, that's the result of Joseph's wise policies. Listen to me. If you're taking notes, write this down. Good government policies create a work mentality. Let me say that again. Good government policies create a work mentality. Bad government policies create an entitlement mentality. That's true. Yeah. Lyndon B. Johnson, his war on poverty. How many of you remember his war on poverty? What did it do? It created more poverty. The reason we have so much poverty in America today is because we created an entitlement mentality. People, that's wrong. But the reason it's wrong is because it goes against what human nature is. And when you go against what human nature is, let me tell you, you're screwed. That's the way it is. Now look at verse 19 again. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. Now, most people don't understand what the Egyptians were asking for. What they were asking for was to become indentured servants to the government in exchange for food. Now, does everyone know what an indentured servant is? Because an indentured servant is not a slave. That's why that's a bad translation. If you don't know what an indentured servant is, let me give you the definition. An indentured servant was someone who agreed to work for another person for a set period of time in exchange for something. The majority of people who came to America, when they immigrated over here, many of them came as indentured servants. They had a debt, or they wanted to get over here and they couldn't pay for their travel over here, so they said, I'll work for you for 7 years, I'll do this type of work, and at the 7 years, I'll be free and I can go on. So the majority came as indentured servants. They were not slaves. They agreed to work for another person for a set period of time in exchange for something. So what the Egyptian people wanted was to work for the government for a set period of time in exchange for food. And because they were farmers, they were offering to work their land when the famine was over. And they would give a percentage of it to Pharaoh for a certain amount of time in exchange for food. That's what they meant when they said, buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. They were wanting to become indentured servants to the government in exchange for food. They did not want to become permanent slaves. They wanted to be indentured servants, which meant they would only be Pharaoh's servants for a set period of time. Now, if you don't understand the culture, you don't realize what they were asking for. So you don't understand what Joseph was agreeing to. That's why it's very important for you to know that they were offering to become indentured servants, not permanent slaves. So, when they asked to become indentured servants in exchange for food, Joseph had to negotiate a contract with them. He had to negotiate an agreement with them. And here's what they had to come to an agreement on. Number one, What type of work would they do while the famine was going on in exchange for food? You see, the majority of the people were farmers. Probably 98% of the people in Egypt were farmers, but they couldn't farm as long as the drought was on. Remember, the famine was caused by the drought. Number two, how much would they have to give Pharaoh when the famine was over and they started farming their land again? Remember, they're offering to make their land, not just themselves, a servant of Pharaoh. Look at verse number 19 again. Why should we die before your very eyes? Buy us and our land. Don't just buy us and our land in exchange for food. We offer our land and ourselves as slaves for Pharaoh. So what they're doing is they're saying, we'll work our land for you for a certain amount of time. So that's the third thing they had to agree on, the length of time. The third thing they had to agree on was the length of time they were willing to work for Pharaoh in exchange for food. Now, verses 20 through 26 explains the contract or the agreement that Joseph made with them. And let's go through this section verse by verse, starting with verse number 20. Notice what it says. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sowed him their fields because the famine was so severe, and soon all the land belonged to Pharaoh. Now the word bought is translated from the Hebrew word kana, which in this context means to acquire the right to something. So Pharaoh acquired the right to a percentage of their harvest when they started farming again in exchange for giving them food. Now, some people held out because they didn't want to become indentured servants to Pharaoh. They didn't want to have to give Pharaoh a percentage of what they harvested when the drought was over. So they held out. They said, no, we don't want to do this. But the famine was so severe that eventually everyone had to agree with it. Look at the last part of verse number 20. So Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh. All the Egyptians sowed him their fields because the famine was so severe, and soon all the land belonged to Pharaoh. Now remember, there's a difference between a permanent slave and an indentured servant. A slave was the permanent property of someone. An indentured servant was someone who agreed to work for another person for a set period of time in exchange for something. So the Egyptian people agreed to work for Pharaoh during the famine in exchange for food. And they agreed to work their land for Pharaoh after the famine. So now there were only two things left that they needed to agree upon. Number one, what percentage of the harvest would the Pharaoh get when they started farming again? And for how long? So let's see what they agreed upon concerning those two things. First, how much would the Pharaoh get when the famine was over and the people went back to farming their land? We'll look at verses 23 and 24. Then Joseph said to the people, look, today I have bought you and your land for Pharaoh. I will provide you with seed so you can plant the fields. Not now, but when the drought is over. Don't worry about it. I know you're not going to have any seed. I'm not going to try and get blood from a turnip, right? No, I'm not going to do that. So what I'm going to do is, when the famine's over, I'm going to give you seed so you can plant your fields. Then he goes further. Then when you harvest it, 1/5 of your crops will belong to Pharaoh. In other words, 20%. You may keep the remaining 4/5 of the seed, 80%. As seed for your fields and as food for you, your households, and your little ones. So Pharaoh would get 20% of what they harvested, and they would be allowed to keep 80%. Well, in verse 26, we find out that it would last indefinitely, because that's the next thing they wanted to know. Well, if we've got to give you 20%, how long are you going to expect to take 20%? And what they found out, it was indefinitely. In other words, it wouldn't end. Look at verse 26. Joseph then issued a decree still in effect in the land of Egypt, that Pharaoh should receive 1/5 of all the crops grown in his land. Only the land belonging to the priest was not given to Pharaoh. Churches didn't have to do that. Wow. Here Joseph is, and he's giving us a policy. You hear all these people, churches should pay taxes too. That'd be double taxation. You've already been taxed for those contributions you're given. So they didn't have to, but I want you to notice this. It says, Joseph then issued a decree still in effect in the land of Egypt. Do you see that? The decree that Pharaoh would take 20% of what they harvested was still in effect when Moses wrote the book of Genesis. You probably didn't pick that up. Who wrote the book of Genesis? Moses. And Moses says, Joseph then issued a decree still in effect in the land of Egypt. From the time of Joseph to the time of Moses, it was supposed to be indefinite. In other words, from now on, you'll always pay 20%. Because Moses lived 400 years after Joseph. So in exchange for food, they agreed to pay a 20% tax on their harvest, which was a great deal because the amount of taxes levied was often left to the discretion of the leader. If you remember, he took 20% just because he wanted to. Now, he knew the dream, but Pharaoh came in on Joseph's recommendation, and he taxed all of the people 20%. But what he told them is, this tax will continue on indefinitely. And this permanently fixed taxes at 20%. Let me say that again. This decree permanently fixed taxes at 20%. That's why the people were so grateful, and they loved Joseph. Look at verse number 25. You have saved our lives, they exclaimed. May it please you, my Lord, to let us be your servants. Yeah. In other words, we agree to this. Now, let me make an important point. This is very important. If you're taking notes, you need to write this down. The Bible advocates, and Joseph set up, a fair tax system. Yeah. Now, the word fair means that the same standard applies to everyone. In other words, everyone paid the same percentage in taxes. If you were rich and owned a lot of land, you paid 20% of everything that you harvested. If you were poor and you owned a little bit of land, you paid 20% of everything you harvested after the famine. Rich or poor, you paid the same percentage. And people, it's the same way with tithes. Rich or poor, you're supposed to pay the very same percentage, 10%. The rich will pay more tithes because they make more. The poor will pay less tithes because they make less. But they both pay the same percentage. That's fair. The same standard applies to everyone. So don't buy into this liberal philosophy that the rich need to pay a higher percentage rate and call it their fair share. That's bullcrap. Well, the rich need to pay their fair share. Honey, you don't know what fair means. Fair means the same standard applies to everyone. And this is from the Bible. There's nothing fair about the rich paying more, and it's not biblical. Everyone needs to pay the same percentage in taxes. Why? Because that provides the right incentive to work hard. Now, let's be honest. Normally, the rich don't pay as much. Why? Because they have all of these deductions. They're not smart. They're not stupid. They're smart. So they lobby and they get all of these deductions. So sometimes they don't pay as much. But the truth of the matter is, if you put the same tax on everyone, took away all of the deductions, then everyone would pay the same, and it would be a fair tax. That's what Joseph did. And the reason this section is put in here, the book of 1 Corinthians tells us, it's written for an example to us. And when we follow these biblical principles, then our nation prospers. When we don't follow these principles, then we pay the consequences for it. Now, let me go backwards for a second, because we didn't talk about what the people did during the famine. Remember, over 98% of the people were farmers, but they couldn't farm as long as the famine was on, as long as the drought was taking place. So did Joseph allow them to sit around and collect food without working based on the promise that as soon as this drought is over, then I'm going to get 20%? No. You want to know why? Because they had 3 more years to go. And in 3 more years, they would have gotten lazy. No one would want to work. We just sit here and collect. They didn't do that. Look back at verse number 21. And as for the people, he removed them to cities from one end of the borders of Egypt, even to the other end thereof. You want grain? We're going to have to remove you from your land. You're going to come back to it because we have this agreement. We're going to be able to have you farm, but we're not going to have you sitting out there not doing anything. We're not going to pay subsidies. You get paid for not planting your crop. You get paid for not producing. We're not going to do that. No. Since they couldn't farm, As long as there was a drought, Joseph moved all of the farmers to certain cities throughout Egypt. Does anyone know why he did that? Well, two reasons. First of all, that was where the grain was stored. If you remember, Joseph had the grain stored in different cities throughout Egypt. Remember what Genesis chapter 41, verse number 48 says. During those years, the good years, Joseph gathered all the crops grown in Egypt and stored the grain from the surrounding fields in the cities. Not city singular. He didn't bring it to one place. No. He put it in these various cities. So if you farmed in this location and had this 20%, they brought it to that city. So what he did was, when they couldn't work during this drought, he removed them to the cities. And the reason he did that, second reason, was because that's where the work was. You see, the work they were required to do in exchange for food was construction. So during the famine, the people worked on public projects. You know what's kind of interesting? You know what archaeologists have found? They have found, digging up in these cities, these huge storage facilities. And they've still found grain in them. And they go back and they say, we think this is what Joseph built. And in each one of these cities, they marvel at the public works projects that were done. You want to know why that was able to take place? Because during that time, Joseph put them to work. They couldn't farm, but they could do public work projects. And that's what they did. Now, once again, we see that Joseph made the people work for their food. Yeah, it wasn't given to them. So if they couldn't work their fields, then they worked on these public projects. Now, let's make some application. We're going to start with just application towards the government, but then we're going to pull it in and make some personal application. First of all, Joseph understood human nature. He understood that if he wasn't careful, the famine would create an entitlement mentality, especially if the government gave the people food. He knew that if the government did that, the people would come to expect the government to take care of them. Therefore, he made them pay for the grain. There was no free lunch. Secondly, he also understood that if he gave the people food, they wouldn't be frugal with it. Instead, they would waste it. It's the old easy come, easy go. So it wouldn't be long before the grain was all gone. Remember, the grain that they collected during the 7 years of prosperity had to feed the people during the 7 years of famine. And to do that, they couldn't waste any of it. Now, the reason we have such a large national debt is because we waste money. And we all know why we waste money. It's because our government gives things to people. We don't make people pay for it or earn it. We give it away. So it's easy come, easy go. So here's the bottom line. Good government policies create a work mentality. Bad government policies create an entitlement mentality. But here's what's interesting, and this is where we make personal application. These very same principles apply to raising children. Let me say that again. These very same principles apply to raising children. Because human nature is the same, whether you're a child or you're an adult. If you give everything to your children without them having to work for it or earn it, number one, they're not going to appreciate it. So they're not going to take care of what you give them, or they're going to waste it. Why? Easy come, easy go. But secondly, your children will develop an entitlement mentality. And that's what we see among children today. In their mind, you owe it to them. And they shouldn't have to work for it, but you should give it to them. In fact, listen to me, because this is very important. Some of you are prosperous, and that's what God wants. In fact, the book of 1 John makes this comment. I wish that you would prosper even as your soul prospers. Does God want your soul to prosper? Yes. So what is he saying when he says, I wish that you would prosper even as your soul prospers? Well, as much as I want your soul to prosper, I also want you to prosper physically. That's why God gives us principles on how to prosper. Now, a lot of people are against the prosperity message, but they don't understand what prosperity is. So let me explain what prosperity is. The word prosperity, that word prosper in 1 John, it comes from the Greek word euhodos. Euhodos means good trip. In fact, it's a compound word. It's made up of more than one word. It's made up of two words, the prefix "u," which means good, and hodos, which means road, way, or trip. When you combine it together, it means good trip. You want to know what prosperity is? It's not being a millionaire. It's not owning a mansion. It's not driving a new car. Prosperity means you're having a good trip while you're here on this earth. You don't have to be a millionaire to have a good trip. You don't have to live in a mansion to have a good trip. Just because you didn't win the mega millions of 1.6 billion last week doesn't mean that you can't have a prosperous life. My grandfather was prosperous and he didn't get indoor plumbing till I was 5 years old. My dad did not have electricity until he moved out of the house. He studied by the kerosene lamps. Yeah, that's how they lived. If you would have talked to my grandpa back then, he would have felt like he was prosperous. He was having a good trip. He was making a good living. He was doing what he wanted to do. It was hard work, but he was prosperous. Now, some of you are more prosperous than others. You're having a better trip in today's society because you're taking maybe better vacations, or you are able to live in better homes. That's prosperous too, however you say good trip. But I want you to understand something. The more prosperous we become, the easier it is to just give our children things. My mom stayed at home when I was growing up. Later on in life, kids got out of the house. She went to work. She even owned her own jewelry store for a time. But what's kind of interesting is we had a one-income family. My dad worked, but he had 5 kids. And I learned early on, if I wanted certain tennis shoes, then I was going to have to pay for it. If not, Dad was going to buy these type of tennis shoes. And they weren't cool. If I wanted to wear Levi's or Wranglers, and not just any old pair of blue jeans, then I wasn't going to have to buy it myself. I was going to have to work for it. But you know, we become so prosperous because we usually have 2-income families. We have 2 good jobs. And you know, we want our kids, everyone wants this, we want our kids to have an easier life than what we had. The problem is, when you begin to give them everything, the more prosperous you become, the more conscious you have to be of instilling within them an entitlement mentality, because that's what we do when we give things to them. It's just so easy to give it to them. And before long, they just expect it. And then you wonder why they left their bike outside in the rain. You wonder why they didn't make it home from their friends with their shoes on. Where are your shoes? Oh no. You've been walking barefoot this whole time? Yeah. Well, do you remember where you left? No. Gonna have to go buy them a new pair of shoes. No. Maybe they'll call DHS, send them to school barefoot. People, we're going to have a crisis soon. And the reason we're going to have a crisis is because the mentality of our nation is horrible. We have this entitlement mentality, and pretty soon you've got more people riding on the wagon than pulling the wagon. Well, how do you teach your children to work? Well, first of all, you don't pay them for chores. Chores is something they do because they're part of the family. We're a family, and nothing's more important than family. We work together, we help each other, we make personal sacrifices for the good of the family. And if you're part of this family, you work. Now, if you need extra money, we'll find something, yeah, but I'm not going to pay you for mowing the yard. You live in this home and you're not paying mortgage on it, son. I am. So you're going to mow the yard, and no, I'm not going to pay you for it. But you go over there and ask our neighbors if you can mow their yard. And then you tell your neighbor, I'll pay you to pay them. Think your neighbor's not going to take you up on that? I would say on one condition, you also weed eat. Yeah. But people, that's what we need to do as parents. If you don't do that, you're going to have an entitlement mentality, and you're going to have boomerang children. What are boomerang children? After they get their degree, they come home, and they want to live in the home. And they're going to work maybe in their degree if they can find the right job. But many times they're still living at home even if they have a job. And you know why they're doing that? They cannot maintain the standard of living that they want if they have to go out and pay for their own rent, and have to pay for their own utilities, and have to pay for their own food. And let me tell you who's at fault for that. You.